Welcome to Pop and Lock. I'm Landry Ayers. It's just me on the show today, along with my ancient reptilian brain, limbic system, a horrific necktie, and 3 insightful guests. Here to join me in dancing through the dark deluge of ideology that is Disco Elysium are Aaron Ross Powell.
Hello.
Features editor at Reason, Peter Suderman.
Hello.
And host of the Epoch Philosophy YouTube channel, Ian Bennett.
Hello.
I am so excited to have this conversation about this game because I've thought about it a lot, and I believe Disco Elysium might be my favorite artistic work of all time in any genre or any medium. And Ian, in the video that you put together, which we'll put a link to in the show notes on the philosophy of Disco Elysium, you're not quite as hyperbolic as I am, but you do, I think at the beginning of that video, say this game does a better job of proficiently conveying a multitude of things than almost any other work of fiction and artistically applied philosophy. What is it about it that makes it so successful in that regard?
I mean, it's like a really, really broad game, you know? I suppose one of the first things I noticed was when the game first came out, there's like game reviews, right? I'm a gamer. I play games, and when new games come out, especially weird, interesting ones like Disco Elysium, I had no idea what it was. Everyone was talking about the political commentary. Everyone was talking about sort of the sociological or philosophical commentary behind it and stuff. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. Okay, well, I'll give it a try. But when I played it, it's not as apparent as what a lot of reviewers or anyone would be saying. It's actually kind of the facade in a way. It's not necessarily a facade, but sort of a facade is almost like a comedy. Like, it's funny, it's hilarious. And so you're like, wait, for a second, you're like, if someone wasn't really totally paying attention, there would be a lot that they would be glossing over. And that really shocked me, is that they were so good at conveying these certain ideas over this sort of comedic facade that like everyone who talked about the game didn't talk about the comedy. They talked about the actual like commentary behind it. And I just think that subtext, like it is subtext, right? The philosophical commentary, but it's so good it almost isn't, if that makes sense. And I was just kind of just like baffled by that. I was like, holy crap. Like, this is, it's wonderful. It's great. So I think that was probably one of the biggest things, I would say.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me was that so as a role-playing game, you mentioned in your video that the game is ostensibly all about choice and choices we can make, and how instead of grand narrative choices, like there are big moments that happen in the game where you're making choices to do an action that could have dire consequences, but the entire game, there are almost no mechanics other than, stat, sort of placement and picking up items and choosing dialogue options. It is, like a lot of people have said, interactive literature and sort of a visual novel in that sense, rather than a traditional role-playing game. And the developers specifically talked about how they focused on what they called micro-reactivity, which are these small acts and decisions that the player, has to work through, such as a slightful comment or trying to insinuate certain things to certain characters that you're trying to get information out of, and how all of those build upon one another in a much more cohesive way than in a lot of role-playing games where you're making a lot of dialogue choices and sort of building up a character in your mind, but the decisions that actually affect gameplay and what happens in the story usually come down to 1 or 2 choices that are just sets of branching paths, whereas this is much, much more of a dialogue tree scenario, and different choices are building upon one another in ways that you really do not always see the connections between, which I think is interesting when you're specifically talking about ideology, as you had brought up, which is a core component of the game, not just thematically, but mechanically. When you talk about things like the thought cabinet, which I think is a really, really good example of like ludonarrative harmony as opposed to dissonance. Like you have a mechanic in the game, how it's played, the sort of acquiring bits of ideology and thought processes and new ideas. You don't just stumble upon them in locations. They are learned gradually from other characters based on interactions that you have and choices that you make, such that you cannot receive them all in a single playthrough. It is not a completionist's game in that way.
For the folks who don't play or read super nerdy video game commentary, we should probably explain the concept of ludonarrative dissonance, which is basically that a lot of video games rely on in-game game mechanics that seem to conflict with the story. And the classic example here is the Uncharted games, in which you play like a really nice, like kind of heroic modern Indiana Jones-esque guy named Nathan Drake, and you're supposed to like him, and he's just like an essential, like a sort of pulp hero who is very likable and does the right thing. And yet the gameplay is all about you just shooting people in the face, and you just shoot people in the face constantly. You murder dozens and dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of people over the course of these games. And yet, like then you get to the cutscenes and the story is there, and he's like, he's just like a nice, heroic, like essentially good, like he could be at the center of a Marvel movie starring a guy named Chris, and you would like him and it'd be funny. And then you're just shooting people in the face because it's a video game with a lot of action that, like in games, this is a thing that games do. But if you think about it, there is a conflict there. And what this game does is it tries to integrate the gameplay mechanisms such that they are with the actual story. And so, I mean, part of the interesting thing, though, about this game is that it's not, in a lot of ways, a traditional game, because the mechanisms are not, in a lot of ways, all that game-like, and they're not really all that, I mean, and the more game-like they are, the less essential I think they are to the story. This is Ian's YouTube video called this interactive literature, which is I think a better way to think about what this game is, right? It's just a very, very complex branching story. It borrows from some sort of RPG role-playing game mechanics, in particular, the conversations with non-player characters. And so this is something that we've seen in games for decades now, in video games for decades now. You see it also in tabletop games like Dungeons & Dragons, but it's really common in very popular video games like the Bethesda role-playing games, the Fallout, Elder Scrolls, also things, like Mass Effect, right? You see this a lot. And so you have these non-player characters, these players that are controlled by the game mechanism. And you typically in these games, you go up and you ask them questions, and they kind of serve as information kiosks. And they might tell you a little bit about themselves or a little bit about the world, but mostly what they're there to do is provide you with like pretty low-level exposition that's like, you gotta go fetch 3 magic hats from 3 different caves. And then you go fetch the magic hats from the caves, and you return to the NPC, and they're like, great. Now you got to go to 3 different mountaintops and get 3 magic socks. Right, and it's just sort of mechanical, telling you what to do. But here, the RPG, like this game treats all of these NPCs as kiosks, but they're like ideological kiosks, right? Like each one of them is like a portal to some sort of political, interpersonal worldview that you can just interrogate in great, great depth. And so it's that the game is built around just going around and talking to in-game characters, who all of whom have a story to tell you about what they're doing in this world and who they are and why they're standing where they're standing or what they're thinking, but also about how they relate to the game's politics and how they relate to the game's various complicated ideological and political worldviews. And so this game, the question we started here with was, how does this game manage to do so much? And I think part of it is just that it's structured around really deep, quite complex, fairly weird conversations with constructs that you're supposed to think of as characters, but in fact are these sort of idiosyncratic, kind of sly, kind of wry, ideological kiosks, right? And so it uses the kiosk mechanism from other video games as a way to give you an extremely deep, and yet also, as you said, often quite funny and like personal and idiosyncratic way to explore a particular worldview.
I think the one thing that makes this particularly interesting is that it is such a political game, but the politics of it, and it may be the most deeply political and informed about politics and political ideology game I've certainly ever played. But it's not ultimately like about politics, or the role that politics plays in this is not about what institutions should we have, what steps should we take, what freedoms or not should we have, but this is more a game about ideology as identity formation, and the way that ideology is about deciding kind of who we want to be in a given moment, and then the disconnect between identity and the world that we find ourselves in, and the psychological trauma that inflicts. And I think that's where, going back to the ludonarrative harmony, like the absolute brilliance of the thought cabinet is it takes a mechanic that is present in a lot of games, which is like, every time you go up in level, you get some points that you can assign to a talent, and those talents give you special little abilities or bonuses, but you can only take so many of them. But in this one, what it says is, no, these are, you come across the things, the talents are not things you just get when you go up in level. They're things that you come across in the world. Someone mentioned something, and it's an idea that like hadn't occurred to you and is potentially interesting, and now you're going to put it into your head. You're going to decide to put it into your head and mull it. And then after a certain period of time, it becomes part of who you are. Except you can then go and say, I want to remove this from my identity. And so it's not about whether these ideas are true or effective. It's about who is the person I want to build, and what beliefs do I need to go out in the world and find to assemble in that. And then you have all of these characters who are then just trapped in these these, as Peter you mentioned, like these incredibly deep and weird belief systems, but they're not so much about affecting change in the world as they are about just, who do I want to present myself as?
They're often about tribal and communal loyalties.
Yes. But they're also, I mean, there's a realism. Like, I will say, the moment this game, when I was like, oh my God, this game gets me, is when you are stuck in the dingy apartment and the weird guy is talking to you about monetary policy. And I was like, whoever wrote this has been to libertarian DC happy hours.
Well, but what's interesting about the way that they employ this mechanic is that it doesn't, in some sense, allow you to play the game better, right? And so traditionally in a role-playing game, you level up and you can put points into a skill or something like that, right? And there's different ways that these constructs work. But like, let's call it put points into a skill. So you can choose that you're going to get better at archery, or even that there are sometimes conversation-based skills, right? You can unlock additional conversation options, become better at convincing people to let you, which you usually is just like, well, I can convince this person to let me go through this gate without a fight, right? That's like the most common way of using a conversation modifier in a role-playing game. And here it's like, well, if you pick the right one, you can get a little bit more money. And that is, I guess, a little bit helpful. But mostly it's just sort of that it changes the conversations. It's not that you are suddenly better equipped to do the things that the game requires you to do, in part because the game doesn't even require you to do all that much, or at least not in the way of a traditional video game. It's just that as you are doing the things that you can do in the course of the game, you will do them differently, and the conversations will unfold in different ways. And sometimes even your own reflections to yourself will then unfold in different ways. You will have different thoughts about the conversation, or about an object that you find, about the space that you have encountered. And so it's not that you are using these that you are using, the thought cabinet, that you're using these things in the traditional way, which is, I want to build a character that can kill all the monsters. There's no monsters to kill. There's just weird interactions to have with with game-based characters who are going to ask you questions and maybe not try to explain themselves to you. Possibly they'll do a good job, or possibly they will also be kind of deluded about who they are and why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, it's like one of the things that I found was like absurdism itself, like seems to be kind of built into the very fiber of the game. Like not necessarily, or like not only narratively in a lot of senses with how, you know, the story unfolds and you're grappling with ideology, but just like that, what you were explaining, the way that the game functions itself, like there is no right or wrong way to do it. It's by definition, the game's sort of chaotic in how everything unfolds. There is no right or wrong way. It's like you are in this weirdly infinite world with infinite choice, and there's just this overwhelming sense of absurdism everywhere. And I actually think the actual aesthetic of absurdism, the weirdness of the game, right? They definitely highlight it there. But that's definitely like one of the biggest markers of Disco Elysium is that absurdism in my mind.
I mean, it has quests and task lists, which drove me mad because there's no way to figure out how to do them. It's just like you're supposed to go find your gun, and you're like, how would I do that?
And it tells you, it just says this could take a while. Like it acknowledges that it hasn't given you any information.
But it's not like there's a location marker where you go and you defeat like a couple of small enemies, then you defeat a big one, and like there's a, you know, you got to find a hidden door and like pick up a, you know, a +10 sword or something. It's none of that. It's like, go find your gun. I don't know, talk to some people, maybe somebody, as you're doing whatever it is you're going to do, you should ask around about it, I guess.
It's like a really well organized detective thought like list. You know, they're just writing everything down, even to the mental, you know, the mental thing. That's all it does, right? It's not really like a quest log, even though it is. The only reason it says quest log is that's just our language around sort of mechanics like that in a game, right?
Yeah, it certainly works for me. I mean, I've been playing Elden Ring a lot lately, which has been getting a lot of press lately compared to the sort of UI and HUD in that game, which is extremely sparse, just does you no favors. And this is sort of in that vein.
And yet in Elden Ring, you can build a character that is more effective, or at least more effective at important types of tasks, right? It hasn't completely abandoned the idea of tactical superiority and of in-game strategy. And Disco Elysium effectively says there's many different ways to play, but there is no better way to play. And in fact, it almost like this game almost doesn't really even expect you to keep playing. It just sort of allows you to, if you would like to, whereas every other modern video game, even quite artsy-fartsy indie games, they're designed around the expectation, like around getting you to engage with things. And this is, I think, a very engaging game just because it's inherently interesting. But it doesn't try to induce you to play more. There's no, like, reward system here, except for the experience of communicating with all these other people and finding out what they're about.
Yeah, like, you know, with Disco Elysium, it's one of those rare games that, like Elden Ring, like the Soulsborne series, that it not only respects the players, right, and how they navigate everything. It doesn't like have map markers everywhere and stuff like that. But the game also, like, oddly, what I've noticed is it like respects itself. Like it knows, at least with the developers and the artistic way of doing things, it knows what it's trying to do, and it doesn't go above and beyond. You know, you compare that to like the worst Ubisoft titles, right? And it's just it's like this mess of just unasked for guidance, and it's almost insulting to what the game's narrative, to the writing people behind the scenes and developing companies and stuff like that. It's and a lot of games aren't made like that, you know. Like I'm a big gamer, and games like Elden Ring, like Dark Souls, like Disco Elysium, I like games that allow themselves to exist simply.
I mean, to the extent that there is an inducement, it's the murder mystery, right? It's that you want to sort of solve the story, and yet even there, so much of the information you get is not obviously in service of the story. And I think even it's fair to say that as you progress, like a lot of it is just sort of like interesting stuff that you encounter that adds a huge amount of appealing texture to the world, but ultimately isn't like, here's the clue that you then decode and that then provides the answer or at least the next step. Some of the information you get is sort of along those lines, is a little bit more of a traditional detective story clue. But a lot of it is just like, man, what are these guys thinking and why?
Yeah, it strikes to me, I mean, a lot of the influences that this game has, it kind of wears on its sleeve. But one that I don't see listed a lot, but totally jumps out to me as we talk about it, is it seems more like a Coen Brothers movie than anything. It has a sort of Fargo vibe, the absurd, very sort of, I mean, dark farce going on at the same time, all these clues and the sort of very tightly woven plot. It very much strikes me like that.
You can totally imagine their version of this in which the drunk detective wakes up and doesn't know who he is or where, or like anything about himself, and stumbles through an inverted detective story where like none of the clues actually really work. And then like that's a very good reference point.
Peter, something else you said jumps out at me and is makes me very, very curious. You talked about there is no better way to play, and the sort of different routes that you can take throughout this game based on your choices, eventually lead you to the point where you have to lean into these ideologies that the game presents to you, the moralist, ultra-liberal, fascist, is it communist? Is
It's
communist the
communist.
other one?
Yeah.
I believe so.
They call themselves the communards.
Communards.
Yeah, it's communism
Right.
still. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it mechanically, it does seem, in a ludonarrative sense, like we talked about, like there is no better way to play. But a lot of the reception to this game, I have read and sort of seen, it's been called pro-communist, which I don't necessarily buy, but I don't also, I do get a sense that it does come off as anti-capitalist, or at least anti-ultra-liberal or moralist, which are two of the identities that are presented in this, which, because you've got the conflict overarching in the world of Elysium, that you have this failed somewhat revolution and the remnants of this sort of communist community that are resisting the moralist and ultra-liberal forces that are trying to come in. But does the game come down on one side, even outside of plot events that happen, but via the mechanics and the world building about ideology? Is there a right way to play, a best way? Where does the game land on those types of questions?
So I don't think that the game comes down on one side or the other. I guess what I think it does is, in some ways, it critiques and tries to deflate all of the ideologies, but it is particularly harsh on sort of on the ideologies it portrays as more extreme, right? And extremism in this game is often seen as something a little bit is often portrayed in a somewhat more negative light. And I think it's telling that in many ways the most appealing character in this game, the most decent character, is Kim Kutsuragi, who is your partner character, and basically is just there to as a gameplay function. Kim is there to keep things moving and keep you on track to the extent that is possible. But also he's there to remind you that there is decency in the world, and his decency is really important to this game because it doesn't rely on him being an extremely ideological person. Right? That's not ultimately why he's good. He's not good because he's like a hardcore communist. He's also not good because he's a hardcore, free marketer type. Right? He is somebody who is decent to other people, and it is essential small interpersonal decency, as well as the fact that part of that means he's the one character who just consistently helps you, the player character, out. And so to me, like if I want to say that this game sides with anything, it's against ideological extremism and in favor of small interpersonal decency. And that's not like the game doesn't have an ideology that's present that's like small interpersonal decency. That's what you can choose. And yet, like, there is, like, you can often choose to be better or worse, and what the game sort of shows us is that like goodness comes from those small moments and from Kim-like decency.
Yeah, like I think I might almost flip this in a way, because that makes sense. Like, on the surface, I think there is sort of like a constructive narrative where it seems like they're trying to deconstruct like extremist ideologies. And I kind of had that idea for the longest time, but I think the more I thought about it, I think actually almost what the game does is, and I think I'd imagine, I've done a little bit of research with the writers and stuff like that. I think they're Estonian, and they are a bunch of, I think, like, they are a bunch of essentially very left-wing, sort of like what we would call in today's world black-pilled communist, kind of. But that's kind of important. But I think what they're almost doing in the game that I think is really smart is they're actually ironically showing the extremism of every ideology within the game. So it kind of at least me being kind of a theory nerd, it reminds me a little bit of Slavoj Žižek talks a little bit about this, like about how, you know, especially in his book Violence, like how the concept of extremism is very, very hard to map, because it's only in relation, extremism is difference among a certain established order, right? And our world being kind of liberal democracy, we're all Western liberals. But something that can be easy to forget, ironically, is how, you know, even historically, right, liberal democracy was very radical at one point. And then even in today's context, there has to be radical steps taken to ensure liberal democracy, right? And that can exist in a number of ways, right? We might say, like, you know, in the past, like imperialism or war or stuff of that nature, austerity, perhaps. I think I definitely was landing there as well. I was like, this game is absolutely destroying every political ideology in very smart ways. And it does, but like I think it almost paints ideology in general as something that is so extreme because it's so almost like absent from us, like a very communal nature of human beings. Because that's kind of what, like, I don't know if you guys got this. That's kind of what the game sort of does to me. It's like you interact with people on such a human level. Politics is always there, but it's always like some weird mask. For example, the fascist guy, Gary the crypto-fascist. He's like this kind of insecure sort of I don't know if that makes sense. He's like this insecure kind of bothered guy. Like, I know if you like press him on his fascism, he like kind of like, oh, well, you know, and then, you know, Harry is obviously absolutely distraught from his ex-wife and a lot of the hardships he's gone through. And it's like the game like pierces through those ideological veils, and it gets at a very human level. Like, everyone in that game is like a very real person. And I almost feel like the sort of narrative point to me was showcasing the extremity of ideology as a whole, maybe.
But I think it does present that extremity as you said, like a mask for underlying very human feelings. And I was struck, I never got any of the 4 political vision quests that were added in the director's cut, because I guess I never committed enough to a particular ideology to trigger one, but they're on YouTube and I was watching them.
Very suspicious.
And the fascism one, I think, is the best one from that human perspective, because it is all about, it's not defending fascism. It doesn't, you know, nothing in it makes fascism look better, but it's ultimately just like very empathetic to the kind of people who end up in fascist ideologies. So there's the Gary the crypto-fascist, but there's just this sense of like underlying sadness and lack of meaning that drags into this. And I love, there's the line in there, I think it's Measurehead says it to you, where it's talking about like fascism, because you're trying to figure out if there's a way to travel back in time. is the crux of the quest. And someone has told you that these fascist people have figured out time travel. And Harry just dives headfirst into that possibility. And ultimately what you get out of Measurehead is he says that fascism is time travel because the line he uses is, he who clings to the past controls the future. And that's this like kind of getting at this deep lack at the center of like the fascist psychology of just like, I want to control the future, but all I have is this imagined reactionary past, and it comes away like deeply sad. And that's the general sense I get. Like even the communists, their revolution failed, and we don't have the full story of like how it failed, but it seems to be just kind of overwhelming force. But when you find the deserter at the end at the sea fortress, you find the murderer, who it turns out is just kind of a guy who got left over from that revolution and just hung out by himself on this island after being, I don't know if did he run away or he was left for dead? I don't remember for sure. But it's just this like deep sense of sadness that the revolution was an attempt to take these extremist ideologies that we held on to and we build our belief around and operationalize them in the world, to make the world conform to our ideology. And it failed. And it just destroyed this guy to the extent that he spent decades hanging out by himself by a campfire on a like cold and windy island, watching people have lives in the city.
Yeah, I definitely think at the forefront in how they approach the sort of ideological commentary, especially the fascism and communism, is it's just like an utter destruction of political futures. That's something that if you read a lot of contemporary critical theory, it's almost trying to examine that sort of extremely depressed nature and how we approach the future, right? Because there's a lot of critical theory is relatively left wing, and a lot of theory that's made in the 21st century or written or even stuff post the sort of neoliberal revolutions we saw in the 80s. It's such a grappling of like what to do with the future, right? So one of the most popular theorists right now, I'd argue, is sort of Mark Fisher, and that's like his entire thing is like grappling with art and media and how do we envision an actual future. Disco Elysium does that, I think, with the communist and the fascist, and in some respects, sort of like the moralist or the ultra liberals. It's just almost not to the same extent. I would say, and I think that's almost reflective of the developers. I would imagine, because I believe the developers come actually from like a pretty left wing progressive extent, but it's like very smart because they acknowledge that like every sort of left wing endeavor has monumentally failed, and in many respects, I would completely agree with that in reality. But the game also reflects that. So it's like this extreme dark depression, but like it tries to get to the kernel of humanity underneath.
This is a game that does a better job than almost any other piece of fiction I can think of capturing the contingency of governments and social order. And it is a game that, unlike basically every other story and virtually all political discourse, does not treat politics and government as something that exists inherently, right? Or at least particular forms of it. What it does is it says that the form comes out of what people choose and what they do, and the coalitions and associations that they sort of make for themselves. And it all ends up working in this messy muddle. But it's not something that someone just sort of, it's not designed really all that much, right? It's just sort of comes out of a lot of atomized interactions. And it's also, it's not stable, right? It's not this thing that just sort of always, I mean, in some ways, it's sort of a game that does say that politics is always sort of around us and a lens through which we are, through which all of our interactions are taking place. At the same time, it's sort of, there's this perception in so much Western political commentary that the government, that like governments are sort of always here and always going to organize a lot of our lives. And this game sort of says, well, they kind of do, but only just because people perpetuate them all the time, right? And they perpetuate these different forms of them. And it's just like, I mean, the particular way that I think this expresses itself most is just sort of with the policing situation, right? Where you have these police who have been given limited powers in another district, come down to this district, but there's conflict because the local union expects to basically do their own policing to some extent. And it's like, well, do police have authority here? I mean, someone says they do, but that doesn't actually mean that they have any authority. And that doesn't mean, right, like it's a system that is contingent upon other people accepting it. And the game often sort of extrapolates from there and says all of these systems, every single system of social order and organization, they're all contingent on enough people accepting and choosing to sort of to work within them. And all of these, and that's what ideology is, but that's also just like institutional social organization, from unions to corporations to literally the bar that you wake up in. The bar hotel is itself a kind of political social institution within this game and within this town, right? It serves as a hub of information, a gathering point, all of these things, right? It plays a function, but it's just sort of, it's self-organized. And this is a game about how people self-organize, often in conflict with each other.
Arguably the happiest people that we meet in this game, the best, the ones who just seem to be the most content or excited about their current state or the world, are the dice maker, who just is like this completely pleasant and serene and just seems to love what she's doing. And then our hardcore guys starting their disco. And so out of all of the people, the happiest are the ones who are just kind of starting or running their own businesses. And the only other entrepreneur that I think we meet is the bookstore owner.
The pawn shop owner.
Oh, the pawn shop owner. Yeah. But it does seem that these people who just kind of are focusing on their own thing and creating this.
And there's that other little sort of storefront where you can get chemicals over by the
right, but that's just a clerk. That's like this. That's the bored teenager. She's not the person who started that store. But it does seem like it just these people who just like are starting, like the entrepreneurs are our happiest people.
I'm curious about the hardcore people specifically, because I wonder if they because I don't know if they would consider themselves entrepreneurs though, so much as like community leaders. Like they want to create a gathering place where people can listen to music and dance, but I don't know if they would necessarily want to charge for that type of thing, or if they just want to, blare hardcore to the mega music and invite people to dance the whole time. Just the one exception I can see to that.
Yeah, I think it's like almost like the people that are happiest, right, in those sort of entrepreneur type positions, is it's almost like they have imagination. I feel like this game is sort of just, there is a world where revolutions have been crushed, political futures have been decimated to the point where imagination just doesn't really work anymore, right? Like hope is just, it's not really a tangible thing, right? And it can't be, except if you do the things that you sort of enjoy, like make dice, and you just think simply and think smallly. And then you do really weird stuff, like the hardcore people who just want to fuck around and make music or listen to music and just do dumb stuff. Like, it's kind of funny. It's kind of beautiful, but yeah.
Like you said, imagination. I mean, some of the people that have hope, that are persistent, and while they may not, fully appreciate what's going on, there is some hope and happiness in the cryptozoologist and his wife, who pursue something that one of them, if not both of them, in some part of their mind acknowledges is probably not real, in searching for the Insulindian phasmid, which becomes this kind of magical realist, almost Lovecraftian entity that you encounter at the end of the game, that you find out has literally been influencing the sniper over on the sea fort. But this imagination that they have, it animates them and gives purpose to their life outside politics. And it's like this weird moment of joy and sort of zaniness that we get in the midst of all of this. Like, I don't think either of them discuss any politics with you at all. If I recall, Gary the crypto-fascist is with the cryptozoologist, but they're not really discussing that much. And there is a bit of it seems bleak at times, and you end up sort of thinking that, you know, maybe it doesn't exist at all, but then it shows up right at the end. But you get this weird, conflicted, it's a sense of hope because none of the like conflict amongst these people matters in the grand scale of the natural world that has existed long before any of these people. But it is also bleak in that aspect. So it is kind of nihilistic in a way, but depending on how you take it, I mean, I was just really curious because the Insulindian Phasmid made me feel a lot of things, but I didn't come down with a clear answer from the end. And like that and the presence of the pale and the sort of magical realist elements going on in the world were much more interesting to me than any of the political conversations, as interesting as they were. But we only get like this sliver of them. So I was really curious what other people thought about those aspects of the game.
I guess the most interesting thing to me was how, in some ways, uninterested the game was in them. Just because this is a fictional universe in which, like, that sort of thing exists, right? Like, and so in the way that we don't question the existence of rhinoceroses because they just seem normal to us, even though, if rhinoceroses did not exist, and suddenly you saw one running across the plain, you'd be like, what in the hell is that crazy fantasy creature? Why is Guillermo del Toro directing my life? And yet, like, we're just like, it's a rhino. I mean, it's kind of neat. I'll go to a zoo and see a rhino, but I'm not that excited by one, and I don't really feel the need to, like, learn the deep history of how they got here because they're just rhinoceroses. And the game treats its magical realist elements, I think, in that way.
Isn't that kind of I've thought it kind of exactly like that with Disco Elysium a little bit, especially with the Phasmid. Isn't that kind of similar to our own world, I think? Like, sometimes I think we can be a little bit too dogmatic in how we look at really weird things. Like, things we might think that are, like, oddly, like, I don't know, paranormal, or we don't have I feel like the world's weird, right? The world's really, really weird. Like, I think, I really disagree. I think Friedrich Nietzsche kind of said that, the world is bland, and every weird thing that happens, there's an explanation that's really boring, and only whenever you understand the boring nature of the world is whenever the world can ironically be interesting. And I kind of take the reversal. Like, I kind of take the reversal of that. I actually ironically think the world is really, really, like, weird. And I still think there's still stuff, right? This is kind of, I guess, why I'm into philosophy in general, because it's like sort of an endeavor into the weird stuff that might be, right? But I mean, that can exist within, like, quantum mechanics. Like, when you really, like, read about, like physicists, they're like, I mean, constantly there's a debate about what really exists within a certain type, like within string theory, or they're like, there's these theories that are, like, scientifically concrete, but they're, like, also kind of not, and they'll conflict with each other, and they're just like, man, I don't know what's going on here. Like, and I you know, I can't help but think that might actually be an actual, like, metaphysical sort of reinterpretation of our own world in some respects, like the Pale or something like that, you know?
Just on the happiness question, my understanding is that the game makers started this after periods of failure and depression involving sort of long periods of abusive relationship with alcohol, and that this game came to some extent out of dark periods in their own lives. And so I would imagine that if they are imbuing this game with some of their own values, that, like, part of what they sort of realized out of this, it seems to suggest, is that the thing you do to pull yourself out of a dark place is to make something that is wonderful and weird and share it with the world and hope that other people respond. And as it turned out, they did.
Thanks for listening. As always, the best way to get more Pop and Lock content is to follow us on Twitter. You can find us at the handle @PopandLockPod. That's Pop, the letter N, Lock with an E like the philosopher, pod. Make sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and please rate and review us if you like the show. We look forward to unraveling your favorite show or movie next time. Pop and Lock is a project of libertarianism.org and is produced by me, Landry Ayres. To learn more, visit us on the web at libertarianism.org.